we are going to sew this Friday top. It's a square neck top. You can make it from knit fabric or woven. I am going to use quilting cotton, which is a woven fabric, because I want you to know that this is doable with just plain old cotton fabric and your home sewing machine. A couple of things you're going to want. I like this ruler. It's 2.5 by 12.5. It's just very handy. I'm going to use this to mark darts. I'm going to use my Pilot friction pen. I'm cutting out my pattern pieces with a rotary cutter, pinking shears, some pattern weights, probably pins. Pins, I usually use pins with clothing, whereas with bags I'll use clips, and your fabric. I do recommend washing and drying your fabric first. However, I am not going to. Now, one thing to note, you always want to read a pattern first before you start to sew it. I'm not going to show details in here at all. This is not my pattern. It's from Friday Pattern Company. But they have all kinds of tips on fit and fabrics and yardage and what they recommend. So be sure to review that before you get started. Okay, so to speed this video up a bit, I have already cut out this back piece of my fabric. Remember, it's on the fold. It says fold right here. So if I open this up, you will see the full back piece. Now I'm going to refold it and put my pattern piece back in place and pin it because I have not done all my notches yet. There's a notch here I need to pin. And there might be, looks like that's the only one. So I'll just set that aside for now. Now this fabric, I have laid it on the fold. So the fold is down here. My pattern piece, this is the top. I've pinned it in 2 places. You might want to come out here and pin it in a third. You can also use pattern weights if you're more comfortable with that. I'm using my rotary cutter. You can use scissors if you want to. It's just really personal preference. Whatever you're comfortable with is correct. Cut that. You do want these pattern pieces. If they're really, really wrinkly, just give them a quick press with your iron. The tissue, it's fine being pressed. I'm going to turn this so I can cut a little bit better. This table is a little high for me. I don't normally cut up here, but I'm going to make it work. And also for these curves, you probably want a smaller rotary cutter than what I'm using, but again, I'm just making this work. Now there is a notch here, so you want to just do a trim. That's all that is. I don't see any other notches that I need to cut, but I do see a dart. And so these darts, you want to make sure that you're drawing the darts in with the size that you're making. So I got to put my glasses for this part. And what I typically do is I'll mark the dart tip and then the 2 legs, and then I take the pattern away and draw the legs in myself. So let's see here. Solid line is a medium. This is kind of hard to see. I think this is it. Oh, and by the way, for this pattern, they're really generous in giving us different cup sizes. So there's an AB cup and there's a CD cup. So make sure the pattern piece that you're using is first the fabric. So this is the woven front, and this is the CD cup that I'm cutting out. So if you're cutting yours from knit fabric, you want the one that says knit front, and then your correct cup size. Pattern pieces will look huge because we don't have anything sewn. We don't have the seam allowance in here yet. So it's quite normal to think, oh, this just looks enormous. It will work out. For this pattern, they recommend a 5/8 inch seam allowance, which is quite large. So I have grabbed my seam guide and I'm going to put that on my machine. I will show you when we get there. Okay, so my darts are sewn. A lot of times what I'll do is sort of hold this up and make sure that they look even. Yep, that looks good. I have drawn darts on unevenly before. Don't ask me how, but I have a talent for that. Okay, so now we need to consult the instructions. Let's see what our first step is. I bet it's stay stitching the neckline. So stay stitching prevents the neckline from warping as you're sewing the top together. And you don't want to skip it. So now this is not a 5/8 inch seam allowance. When you stay stitch, you're going pretty close to the edge. And you want to start on each side, you just pull it out and each side is done separately. You don't just go all the way around. Okay. Every time I stop, I'm going to leave my needle down in the fabric. And then I'm going to up here. I'm using a poly blend all-purpose thread. It's what I usually use in most of my sewing. You can use whatever you have on hand. Whatever you like best, whatever's most comfortable for you, it's absolutely fine. Okay, so before I take this pattern piece off the back so I can stay stitch the back neckline, I'm going to cut my little center notch of that pattern piece. I keep these handy. I usually have a bulletin board at home and I'll tack them up because you never know when you're going to need them again while you're making your project. And then when I'm done, I fold them up nicely, press them, and put them back in the envelope. So now I'm going to stay stitch the back neckline. Don't pull on your garment in any way. You can just let the feed dogs do the work. Okay. So now we have got those necklines stay stitched. And now we are, oh, I better move. Now I am looking at woven version on page 13, number 2. With right sides together, fold the fabric on the woven front, matching up the dart legs. Sew the dart legs to the dart point and tie off ends. Repeat on both sides. So I did show this on a live recently, how I do my darts. So I'm going to fold one leg to the other leg and make sure they match up. And then I come out here to the point, the pin right through that point. You can use however many pins you need to use. I'm going to sew up my dart leg. Up close to where you're going to finish your dart, you want to turn your stitch length way down, like to a 1 millimeter, and take tiny little stitches as you ease off the edge. And then you're going to lift and pull so you have enough thread here to tie a knot. Okay? One knot. I'm extra, so and then you can trim those away. But I'm going to leave them in for now. Fold the legs so that they meet. Put a pin. Come up to the tippy top. Okay, let's sew this one up. I'm getting up close, so I'm going to turn my stitch length down so it's really small. And ease off, and then remember to pull. This is a tailor's ham. We're going to push this dart down towards the bottom of the shirt. And just kind of mold it around that curve of the ham. This side. So the seam is going towards the bottom of the shirt. Good. And now the shirt will have some curve around the curvy part of the body. Now we're going to sew these shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So right away on my machine, I'm going to measure and mark and put my seam guide at 5/8 inch because for me, usually I'm sewing a little bit less than this, like a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Most of my sewing is like that. So I have to really get my my brain in gear and remember to use a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So this magnetic seam guide is really helpful, and we do have these in the shop. So here I go. Already, see, I didn't want to have it against the seam guide. It just seems so big to me. I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to put this to 2.5, and I'm going to reverse, lock stitch, and then sew all the way down this shoulder. Now over here, it's like a point and it kind of straightens out. Oops, straightens out a bit. Just do your best there. Remember to keep looking at your instruction booklet, okay? So because I'm not using a serger, I have to treat these edges now. So trim, it says trim away excess seam allowance, finish seam edges separately, and press seams open. This is specific to woven fabric. So I'm going to trim. I'm going to leave myself a bit of fabric for strength, and then I'm going to press the seams open like it's telling me to. When you pink, it lessens the amount of fraying that will happen on your fabric. It's better than doing nothing. Okay, so I trimmed quite a bit away, and then I'm going to bring in my iron, and then you can just separate the shirt again for front and back. And this is for woven. For knits, you'll press your seams just to one side, but for wovens, there's a little bit more of a bulk, and the usual practice is to press the seam open. Sometimes I have to kind of lick my fingers and get it started, and then it behaves. And it's easiest to do this on a ham to me because the shirt is already starting to curve. And that's what we want because we're going to wear it. Here we are pressing the seams open. I use the ham because this is already starting to be a curved edge here, even though it's just the shoulders. It's just a little easier to press it on the tailor's ham. Here we are going to sew the facings. So grab both of the facings, lay them out, and let's do this. So this is what we do. Short sides together. In, and then we'll sew across these two edges using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Ooh. Now, I broke my collarbone when I used to race bikes. I was in a bad crash. So on one shoulder for me, I take a little bit more of a seam allowance because my shoulders are crooked. So that's the amazing thing with being a sewist is you can adjust your garments to fit your body. Super empowering. So now I'm just going to press the facing seam allowances open. Your facing will sit flatter. You want to make sure and press those seams open. Then what we're going to do is sew 1/4 of an inch all the way around the facing. It helps it train the fabric so that when we go to turn the edge under, it's much easier. Move my seam guide, I'll move it up to 1/4 of an inch. I love that. It's like constant reminder. And I'm just going to go, I'm not pulling, I'm letting the feed dogs do the work. And I am going to make sure that these seams are sewn flat like this. Sometimes on the curve, I have to lift, my needle should be down and I lift my foot to just adjust the fabric a little bit. If you have to do that, it's okay. What you don't want to do is pull and stretch the fabric. Okay, I'm almost back to the beginning here. So now I have got it all the way around. Press the outer edge of the facing under all the way around using that stitch line as a guide. That is step 7. Start it, and it wants to behave. It wants to do that for you. Really nice. So now after we have sewn around that outer edge, we're just pressing that raw edge under to the wrong side. And this will, when we sew this facing then to the top, it makes it a lot easier to turn this and have a clean edge on the inside. What you don't want when you're sewing garments is to have a bunch of raw edges everywhere, even on the inside, because over time and washing, they will absolutely fray. So you just don't want to do that. So any pattern worth its money will have you do things like this to turn under those raw edges. Don't worry, all this gets sewn down. It's easy. We just have to take it step by step. Okay, our facing is ready to be attached to the top. So lay your top out flat, and we're going to center these notches. Make sure you're sewing the square part of the facing to the square part of the top, matching all the notches, and match the seams, the shoulder seams to these facing seams. Just take it step by step, and then you're going to pin and you're going to ease it all around. If you're having any trouble, it could be your seam allowances, so check that first before you start cutting things up. You can do this, I know you can. That is attaching the facing. Now down at this sharp corner, I'm going to go forward, back a stitch, forward a stitch, needle is down, lift my foot, and I'm going to turn. And then what we'll do is we'll clip diagonally into this stitching line to give us a really nice crisp corner. Don't sew over your pins. Try to remove them as you come up to them. Same thing here. I'm going to go forward, backward, forward, lift. And I will have to take out my pin. Hold this in place. Make sure that my seam allowances are not getting curled up and crunched in there. I lifted my foot slightly so that I can flatten out those seam allowances. Here we're coming around. This is the curve of the back neck. Remember not to pull and stretch. If you have threads getting in the way, just grab your scissors or here's my pinking shears. I'm just going to give it a snip there so I'm not sewing over anything and having anything pull. Coming up to this second shoulder seam here. And back to the beginning. And that was it. I usually trim my threads first and then carefully feed my garment through here. So right here, one of the most important things to do is to cut into those corners up to the sewing line on that seam. That will allow for a really crisp square corner. And you want to make sure you're cutting deep enough. So now I'm using this gigantic rotary cutter to trim my excess seam allowance away. Don't use a 60 millimeter like I am. I'm at work, I'm making this work, but if I were at home, I'd be using a small 28 millimeter rotary cutter, or you can use scissors, that's absolutely fine too. Now we're pressing the facing away from the garment, and we will edge stitch here. Now we're going to understitch really close to this seam all around the collar. I'm just going to move my seam guide because this is really close. So if you can see here, I am catching this seam as I'm sewing. That'll make it behave. I'm getting really close to that seam line. It shows it quite well on the diagram in the pattern. Now we're I can't even say it, edge stitching. And that just trains this facing to sit more nicely once we have the garment on. So make sure you're catching your seam allowance here. The seam allowance is towards the facing, and you can feel it, very much so you can feel it. And you might be able to see it as well, especially on a light fabric such as I'm using. But we stitch it down so that it trains that facing under later. Okay, so now because we did that understitching, it's going to really behave for us. Do this. And I do turn under that outer edge that we sewed that 1/4 inch seam allowance, remember? I turn that under as I'm pressing. It doesn't hurt because we'll have to do that next anyways because we're gonna top stitch top stitch that down anyways. So might as well press it under as we're pressing this collar, the facing, I mean. And move your fabrics if you need to. Move your piece so that it's comfortable for you to be pressing. Don't try to, contort your body to do the pressing. Now this part is a little tedious, but just put on a Netflix or something and take your time. We are pressing this facing to the wrong side of the top all the way around. Now I do choose to also press under that raw edge at the same time, but you can do that separately. It's no problem. I just cut corners wherever I can as far as time goes because I don't have a lot of time. But yeah, this is just pressing that facing to the inside of the top. All the raw edges will be hidden, and then we sew around that outer edge of the facing all the way around. And basically your garment is almost done. We're gonna sew the top together along the sides and hem the sleeves and the bottom, and we're finished. If you feel like this is the hardest part, it is, but you can do it. Just take it, again, step by step. If you're having puckers in those corners, it means you didn't clip far enough in towards that seam. So go back in and clip it further, but don't go through your stitching. This takes me forever. That's why I sped it up. I didn't want to bore you with this video. So this is sped up, I think 300%. So you can imagine this did take quite a while for me to press and pin all the way around. Never feel rushed. However long it takes you is correct. You do you. So number 11, we're going to top stitch the facing in place using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Yep. So we're almost done with this top, if you can believe it. This is the hardest part. You get through the hardest part first, and then it's just easy breezy after this. So I like to give everything a quick once over and flip it to the front and make sure nothing is weird. Sometimes it's easy to fold and get a wrinkle in there. You just want to just flip it over quick. And I've got this on a 3. I like to start near a shoulder seam so that if I have to make adjustments, I can in that shoulder seam. And I will be trimming all these excess threads very soon. One corner here, I'm going to leave my needle down. Feels good underneath. Now this one I can tell something there. I had to just pull it taut a little bit right there in that corner where I would have sewn a pucker in. So this is not a time for children to interrupt or the TV to be on. Anytime you need to stop, have your needle down. Sometimes around those curves, the seam wants to kick up, so just train it back under. And we're back to the beginning. Now, we're going to press. I bet you guessed it. If anything is wrong with your neckline, fix it now. It's much easier to do it now versus when we have these sides closed up at the top. Oh, yeah. I just come in with my iron. I give everything a press. You'd be surprised what you can press out. A lot of times you might think there's a mistake, but it's just a matter of being pressed out. Oh, I'm loving this. This is going to be so cool. You know, I'm going to wear this top to H&H, Ramel, because it's got a bunch of yarn on it. Okay, so there it is. Flipped around. So I'm doing the woven version, so I'm moving on to step 12. Right sides together, pin the front piece to the back piece at the side seams. Make sure that your darts are downward. So it looks like a bread cutout. Oh yeah, I can see what. So that means these darts here, we don't trim these away. They stay there. They have to be going down. You don't want them flipped up when we sew these side seams. Okay, so you're gonna start from that lower sleeve end. Random pink thread. Just shake it out and look, make sure everything's pretty even. So what we're gonna do from here is start down here. Don't sew your sleeve together. Start from here and come all the way down. I mean, you might laugh, but I've done that before. So start here and come down this side. And we are using the 3/8, or 3/8, geez, there I go again, 5/8 inch seam allowance. So if you want to put your seam guide back on, like I do, go ahead. And then, you know what? I need to clean up these pins so that I don't hurt myself. Get those out of the way. And here we go. Remember to lock stitch. All that means is go forward, go backwards a little, go forward again. Just locks the stitches in place. Okay, see what I did? I got a little bit away from my seam guide. That's okay. It just feels like such a big seam to me. Now, remember, you can, if you want to, serge this if you have a serger, but it's totally doable with the machine. We're going to pink this edge in just a second. Remember, I leave my pin in. I'm just going to pull it back a little. That dart gets sewn down. And I never sew over my pins. It's not worth it. Okay, good. I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to grab my pinking shears. I'm going to take the dart pins out. Did I put my pinking? Here they are. Come into that seam allowance. So I'm just trimming my seam allowance down a bit with wovens. You want to do that so there's not extra bulk in your seams. And I do use my pinking shears because then I don't have to go back and do a zigzag stitch. It takes forever. So here I'm pressing my seams open, and the tailor's ham is a big help with this because the shirt is already curvy. This can take a little bit of time. Don't worry, it's just fine. We're almost there. Okay, so now we are on step 14. You're going to skip that knit version, go down to 14, turn the raw edges of the sleeves under 3/8 of an inch, and then another 3/8 inch. So this, I've been doing this a long time, so I eyeball this, but you can come in and mark your seam allowance. There's nothing wrong with it. They also have these cool edge rulers that you can iron on for garment making that have seam allowance in there. But if you think of it like this, 4/8 of an inch is a half an inch, right? So this is just a little bit under a half an inch. So that's how I think of it. Make sure when you're folding that seam there that you're getting the seam so that it's flat and not all kinked up or something. There, I'm going to make sure it's flat. And then we fold it again, another 3/8 inch, and then we'll sew around this and that sleeve is done. Can you see how close we are to being finished? If you want to use pins here, go right ahead. I find that by the time I get it to the machine, it's pretty well trained and I can just hold it. But do what you're most comfortable with. If you're not comfortable with no pins, don't do it. It's not worth, the 10 seconds of savings it gives you. All right, let's take this to the machine, and I'm going to sew this down right away. I can remove my seam allowance. I'm going to start at that underarm right in the armpit because if I have to fix anything, I want to do it in the seam. So I put that in and then I go forward a little bit. Oh, sorry. Can you see now? Okay, here we go. Remember not to pull, just let the feed dogs do their work. And I'm really close to the edge of that fold. This is an edge stitch, so you're really close to the edge. Yes, it's a double fold. An edge stitch just means you're close to the edge. A top stitch usually means you're about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. So there's really no difference in technique other than being close to that fold. And this encases all raw edges, so there's nothing for you to do. You can throw it in the washing machine, the dryer, and you will not have a bunch of frays. And there we are. I will trim those threads in a moment. So that sleeve is done. I'm just going to press it. Yay! We'll do this to this sleeve and then the bottom, and our top is finished. And then we'll put it on. So this is sewing down the seam, the sleeve hem, which I do absolutely correctly. Now you're going to see me take a Natalie shortcut here. This is not what the pattern tells you to do. This is what I do because I was really scared this top was going to be too cropped for me, and I don't do crop tops, okay? I'm not that age. So I pink sheared the bottom hem and then just folded it up very tiny for my hem and sewed that down. Now what you're supposed to do is do another double fold hem. But I thought, oh geez, I cannot have my belly button shown. Are you joking? And I would have been fine, but sometimes you get panicky. And I needed this to work out. So that's what you're seeing me do here. As always, for sewing, you do what you think is best. You're in charge, always. And don't let anybody tell you any different. Just really comfortable, and it's easy to sew. All right, I'm going to press it quick and I'll be right back.